Thanks for listening to the Scottish Housing Podcast. You can find out more about the presenters by going to scottishhousingpod.com, and you can also follow us on social media. We are on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok and Facebook. Just look up at Scottish Housing Pod. Welcome to 2025 on the Scottish Housing Podcast. If it looks as though it's a bit Heath Robinson behind Stephen and I, that's because we've moved room and where we are for the podcasting, and it's just half set up. So apologies for the mess. You should see it even more behind the camera. So what we thought we'd do for the first podcast, and if you see me fiddling about on the computer, is to get statistics. What we thought we'd do on the first podcast of the year is really sort of set some context of where Scotland is, but also Stephen's such a fantastic expert on politics for obvious reasons. That we thought we'd also talk about where politics is because it impacts so much on housing. So, Stephen, I'm going to firstly go through some house price statistics and tell me just what immediately you think of when you hear some of these. So this is to the end of November, so it's not quite the full year because the December ones aren't out yet. So the average house price in Scotland was £195,000 last year, which is a 4.7% increase year on year. Types of houses, detached houses, their average house price is £345,000, up 5%. Semi-detached houses up very similar, 5.3% to 208,000. Terraced houses 166. Flats and maisonettes 135,000, so up 3.6%. And UK average house price is £290,000. So Scotland's roughly 100 grand behind the UK. For a period of time, you were a decision maker in Scotland in politics. So firstly, just in general, what's your thoughts on what that says about Scotland, where we're going? Because I always think the house market's a brilliant insight into what the economy is doing, and then UK as a whole. So tell me your thoughts.
So I suppose the immediate thing that springs to mind is that it really underlines the supply and demand issue, which we have touched on in a number of our podcasts in the last calendar year, and a number of guests have raised it. So if prices are going up, it's because demand is high, and it's one of the reasons that all the prices go up in any sector or anything we're doing is when demand is high. Certainly it's the most basic rule of economics, isn't it?
Yeah.
Supply and demand. And I think anecdotally, any of us that know anybody in the last year or so that has been looking to move house, it's tricky. You're competing with a great number of people, and of course a small number of people are in the privileged position that when they really want something, they're able to hit that jackpot number for the seller about the highest price. I think that's the first thing it tells us. If we need yet another piece of evidence to the supply issue in the country, then that is it. The second thing is, you highlight the gap in financial terms between us and south of the border. I think the other thing that in comparing ourselves to England that it reminds me of is that one of the things I learned when in public office and doing what I do now is that in terms of snapshots of the economy, is that Scotland is always that bit behind where the economy is in the rest of the United Kingdom. And it's always been explained to me is the further you are away in any country from the financial capital, the harder it is to get investment and see growth. But when slowdowns or recessions come, it takes a bit longer to reach you. And equally, it takes a bit longer to recover. And if I remember, it was round about this time last year that I was beginning to pick up the constant narrative from England about the higher than average increase in house prices. So it almost feels as if that's where Scotland's coming in, reminding us that that's the general rule when you're looking at the Scottish economy, to consider we're that bit further away from the financial centre in London. What we see happening down there is likely to reach our shores, just like when the tide goes out, it'll take a wee bit longer, and it'll already be out elsewhere. And the reason I mention that is because I think it picks up in a flavour of some of the discussions we had in last year's podcast about, in many ways, that's what should make it easier for our key players in government here in Scotland or in the private sector to be able to look ahead and plan for where the economy might be, because you get this snapshot of how things are emerging. It begins in London. London's not comparable to the rest of the UK, but once you begin to see it bubble out into the Midlands and Northern England, you kind of know what's coming our way. And the third thing that jumps to mind when you just mention those statistics is, on the basis of those two reflections that came immediately to mind, is that actually, like a lot of people in other sectors outside of housing and generally the economy are saying, is this is a pivotal year for the whole economy on this island. And it's pivotal because we've had the long-anticipated general election, although it was early. That Sunak went earlier than he was required to. There was so much speculation for so much time, there's so much uncertainty around that particular government, and it was a shaky government for lots of reasons and had been since 2019. The election's out the way. This government, no matter what people are thinking about the report card that they're marking so early on after only 6 months or so, is in and elected for a 5-year term with a very large majority. So there is a government that's in place. We don't have the uncertainty of elections coming along the way. The UK government has made its decisions around its budget and set out what the outlook is for the next 5 years, the things it believes it has to do to correct the economy and public sector economics that it's inherited, and it is doing what it believes is the right thing for growth. We're beginning to see, just topically this morning, inflation stabilising, wage growth is stabilising, and the international scenario, maybe not politically, but in terms of things like there is a bit of stability, dare I see it, emerging perhaps in the Middle East. It kind of feels as if we're getting to the end game in Ukraine. Energy prices and oil prices have stable, all of these things. So 2025, I think, is going to be a pivotal year. I don't think it's going to be an easy year in economic terms, and with housing so related to the performance of our economy, this is a big factor. I've heard people that I'm speaking to in business talk about business confidence is low. I mean, there's nobody you speak to in the business community, no matter what sector, that do not feel anything other than a low mood. And I'm not a doom and gloom kind of person, but that is the reality. And I'm hearing people use the terms like, we've got to stay alive in 25, we're just going to get through 2025, we try and plan for 26, but 25, we've just got to get to the other end of 25. So that's how we enter the year. And that's before we think of the politics, it's before we think of the implications of what will a Trump presidency mean for the whole world economically, for Europe in particular. Britain is this kind of standalone country that we are now. What will the next moves by the new UK Labour government? Just this morning, rumours of, although the Chancellor said she wouldn't be having any other thing than one budget a year, now looks like there'll be some kind of mini budget in March. And what's going to happen in the Scottish Parliament, particularly around the housing bill and related issues. So before we even think about them, we have got this economic picture. And for me, what's coming out of those housing stats highlights that this is a pivotal year for the UK economy and therefore the Scottish economy, but it's a very delicate one.
So housing is, as you touched on, and as I mentioned, housing is so massively impacted by, obviously, microeconomics of the local economy, macroeconomics of the wider world economy. And, people think we can escape from globalisation, but you've got the macroeconomics of what the Westminster budget does, and then you've got the macroeconomics of, there's been a lot of publicity about the gilt markets and UK cost of borrowing, but actually everybody's gilts are going up because of the expectation of what a Trump presidency is going to bring. So economics and politics are so massively interconnected on this. So if we then start at the big level, because people's jobs are at risk and all these types of things, so they start at the biggest level, there's mention of, obviously, the end of the Ukraine war. My perception, so you're closer to people in power than me. My perception, actually, I've calmed down a bit about Trump. I know it might sound ridiculous. I'm starting to think that his most extreme stuff is now just because he likes winding people up. He realises it's saying he's not ruling out invading Greenland and Canada should be part of America. Part of my brain says, wait a minute, if Putin was saying Poland should be part of his sphere of influence and he might invade Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, i.e. 4 NATO countries, we'd be talking about, do we need to start conscription because we're going to war? We get the President of America talking about not ruling out invading a member element of NATO. And that's why I think he's starting to say these things just for effect. So in the macro politics stuff, am I being too optimistic when I think it's not going to be quite as bad as the end of the world stuff that people are thinking? Because my perception actually is what he wants to be able to say to people is, see, after I came to power, the Middle East stopped being he made a big play of when he was in power last time, there was no wars going on. I think he wants to be able to say, see, as soon as I came to power, Middle East stopped. See, within a few months of me coming to power, Ukraine and Russia stopped. So contrary to what he says, my perception is that he likes the idea that he can say to people, you may think I'm crazy, but the world's a more stable place when the crazy guy's in charge. Am I being too optimistic by thinking he might make those changes, do you think?
I think there's no question if you look at the time that he was in office last time and where he set the atmosphere of setting his stall out in terms of international and foreign policy, it will be very different from Biden's or Obama before him as a Democrat, and in fact it will be very different from so-called mainstream Republicans, and he has less interest, as it would appear the American people do. Did they ever really have the stomach for the kind of interventionist
world
policeman's role? And I think that that would appear to be focusing minds in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe as well. In terms of economic policy, the big question mark and about impact it could have on our shores and elsewhere is that of tariffs, and what that means for imports and exports, and what wider effect that has in the economy. The reality is, will our worst fears be realised? Probably not. Are they ever? Will we feel the worst in life about anything? Really, but where it would be true to say that there's a worry if you look at his past record, and will it be different second time round? Mm-hmm. People, him and others that come into power will do this time with experience of being in office for a previous 4-year term. Will he be still the president full of surprises that he perhaps was last time? And even if he's not, really what we need our leaders in the UK and in our Scottish government to do is to be second-guessing the thing that will come along surprises rather than worrying about worst fears being realised. And that's where we need, no matter what kind of government any country has, whether its inclination is to be protectionist or not, mm-hmm. Actually, its first job is one of protection, because the first job of any government is to defend our country, and defend our shores and defend our people. Mm-hmm. But that also includes economically. And that's really where, and perhaps the reason it's not just the whole upset and concern and pushback there's been to Rachel Reeves' budget in October, the first UK Labour budget of this government. I wonder if that is the reason there's perhaps going to be a mini budget in March or April. It's not solely that, it's also about, well, by that time Trump will have been in office for a couple of months, mm-hmm. and we will begin to see the reality of what his agenda is going to be economically, and what impact and what opportunity mm-hmm. it will bring for Britain as well. And all of this is important, as you rightly said, because politics and the economy is so intrinsically linked, and housing is such a significant part of the UK economy. that what happens in the macroeconomics is really important. So, we have a supply and demand issue. It's the biggest, the housing crisis, the housing emergency as it's referred to now. It's the single biggest issue is housing for all sectors, is housing supply, and the decisions that are taken by our macroeconomic leaders, the UK Chancellor in this case, here in the United Kingdom, are hugely significant, because you've already mentioned that one of the impacts is not solely because of the Chancellor's budget here in the UK. You're right, there's an international trend, but one of the impacts has been that actually, despite base interest rates falling, it's more expensive to borrow for investment. And there's been a lot of media comment, particularly since the turn of the year, about the impact that is having for the UK government's own financial projections in terms of the country's debt and public services, but it also has a huge impact on the private sector. So whether that's the development of emerging markets like PRS and build to rent, or whether it's a market for sale, all of these guys and girls that are involved in that part of the industry, it's more expensive to borrow as well. So we have falling base rates, so that you and I paying our mortgage its costs are less, but actually capital borrowing for investment has increased. And what it has done, and what I was finding, I spoke to the time in London for different reasons in December, and client interest, and I was finding I was speaking to folk in the housing industry down there, is that actually, particularly around the PRS market, a bit like has happened in Scotland, and we think it's solely about the Scottish Parliament's housing bill, that whole market has slowed down south of the border as well, and people are unable to raise the investment, and it's partly because of this increase. So I think this is an example in terms of housing, about how these macroeconomics have quite a very, in this whole fast-living world that we're in now, have a very quick impact. And it seems to me that if there's to be a mini-budget in March, or some kind of whatever they call it, because they won't want to necessarily admit that they've had to revisit the budget, whatever they call it, that is yet another issue that will have to be addressed. And there's a whole plethora of strategies. I mean, the public sector and governments and councils love all of this, write strategies and papers. I mean, in the time I was in the City Chamber, since 15 in Glasgow, and 15 years since I've left, you could have papered every committee room in the City Chambers with a number of strategy documents and work plans and working groups and documents that were produced. That was just to deal with the city centre alone, never mind anything else. But there's a whole number of strategies in a new government you would expect to produce them, that are supposed to be coming out in the next few weeks, whether it's for growth, whether it's housing, planning reform, or the much trailed one in the last couple of days about industrial strategy. So all of these things should be feeding into this next fiscal event, as they call them now. You and I understand it to mean a budget of some shape or form. And as you rightly say, all of this politics, economy, intrinsically linked, and therefore for the industry that we're particularly interested in these days, housing, considering it's the number one issue in the country, is linked. So 2025 is a big year, pivotal for the economy. Business confidence very low, it has to be restored, the government has a role in that, so does the private sector and business as well. It's not all about the government need to do things, but it's also going to be a real, we will have this discussion a year from now about whether it was all of that linked together became the turning point to see the number one issue of the housing emergency, the housing shortage, beginning to be addressed or not. Pivotal year.
So in all of that wider economics, that from Trump all the way down, that has an impact on Scottish housing market. One of the things you touched on there that just got me thinking was the concept of build to rent. Now I know 10, 12 years ago when I was dealing with the City of London about investing in affordable housing, one of the reasons it worked, or it was close to working, was because interest rates were so low that you could make the cost of borrowing to build something stack up against low rents.
Yep.
So, of course, one of the issues now is with the gilt markets and a lot of I think what people might not be aware, I know very sophisticated people listen to this podcast, but some of them might not be aware, a lot of the borrowing that housing associations have, for example, who are in a key part of resolving your housing crisis, a lot of the borrowing that they get is based around the cost of borrowing in the bond markets. So they will often be borrowing at UK government bond rates plus 1.5%. So if UK government borrowing has gone up by 2-3%, so if UK government borrowing is up at, say it's 5.5%, that then puts the cost of borrowing for a housing association up at 6.5-7%. And suddenly the ability to borrow and build affordable housing becomes even more difficult.
And this is why what we need the United Kingdom government to do is to be radical in its approach to restructuring the British economy.
Yeah.
And it's got to start with getting its own house inside government and the public sector and public services in order first. And the only way in which the books will be balanced in this country is by a significant reform of public services. It's about what we do, how we do it, and what we need to do. And these are very hard choices that, in most cases, frankly, nothing to do with whichever political party, at UK, Scottish, council level, politicians don't like making. Actually, most politicians are quite conservative with a small c. Mm-hmm. You know, they don't like wholesale change. You don't need a decision, we've got to stop doing this. But actually, that is what's going to have to happen if the government, the UK government, who hold all the macroeconomic power in this country, are to play their part in the three things that they really need to do in terms of pursuing a growth agenda. Number one, stability in the economy, and therefore we just can't have budgets like that again, where there's this fluctuation and mixed messages around taxation and spending, and big pay increases in the public sector adding to the bill, and no reforms. We need stability, and it's going to start in-house, inside public spending first and foremost. Secondly, in feeding into stability is how we get a very stable lending for the necessary lending rates, borrowing rates for the government to do what it needs to do that the private sector won't do, which is significant investment in the infrastructure of this country. It is actually a crime that the predecessor governments did not take the huge opportunity that artificially, extremely low interest rates for what the last 10 years provided. We should have been borrowing to invest in all of the infrastructure that everybody knows is falling round about our ears. Yeah. From housing to transport networks, the state of the roads, public, everything. And the government has said this is one of their significant priorities, is the investing in the modern energy infrastructure that an economy that wants to grow now needs. And that is the third point around whether it's energy infrastructure, whether it's what the balance between traditional and renewable or nuclear energy is. It's about these, I can't even pretend to understand them, but I'm trying to get my head around it because I'm involved in that for some clients, with these huge, big, remarkable data infrastructure centres that are required. This is what will make the UK economy equipped for the long term. And why, and I say it to people in business all the time, they're so frustrated with what they think is mixed messages from the new government, is that this is why, they've been given a mandate for 5 years. You have to cut them some slack because these are big, big issues that they're wrestling with. And naturally people will make mistakes in the early days, but these big decisions that require to be taken around those areas that I've identified, this is my view, are decisions that are in the long-term interests of the country. And if they're not taken now in the early days of this government, no point in trying to do it in the year and 2 years of the leading election, but these are the foundations that will grow this economy again. There's no point looking back and thinking we should have borrowed during the times that rates were low. The governments didn't. And to be fair, those governments had big challenges, whether it was Brexit or whether it was COVID, all of these things that were costing the country a fortune in shoring up the markets, apart from anything else.
The borrowing we did do just seemed to be to stop us falling off the cliff, rather than anything proactive. It was, what would be a way of putting it, was reactive borrowing to shore up the house falling down, as opposed to proactive borrowing to enhance the house of the United Kingdom. That's what it struck me. And so there's a historian, Dominic Sambrook. He's really good on more modern history. So you and I are kids born in the 70s. I don't know whether it's why this is also interesting in politics, because politics was so vivid in that late 70s, early 80s. But it was something I heard on the news yesterday, I can't remember specifically what it was, that just made me think, are we in a very similar time to the 70s? And Dominic Sambrook's done 2 or 3 books about Britain in the 70s under Heath's government, then Wilson and Callaghan. And then he's done stuff in the 80s and Margaret Thatcher. And the gist of it is, because he's obviously done the research of reading the diaries of the people in power, they all knew Britain was bust as a country. They all knew Britain wasn't working. They all knew that the traditional industries of Britain were being outperformed by countries that either were more sophisticated in somewhere like Germany or were just cheaper labour, and that a major change needed to happen. But they all appreciated that major change would result in hardship. Our traditional industries were coal, steel, places like that, items like that, and they existed a lot in Lanarkshire, North Yorkshire, North England, Wales. And the gist of it seems to be they were all aware that the major change they needed to do would have a negative impact and would be difficult for the people in those locations. And I'm very, very much simplifying his synopsis here when everybody put it off. Everybody put off that major change that they knew that had to happen, because it was, getting back to your point just now, because they knew it was hard. Therefore, when it eventually did happen with Thatcher, it was harder and sharper and more critical than it maybe would have been if Wilson had done it in 75. And it was whatever it was in the news, I was thinking, I wonder if we're at this in the 70s now of, we need that volte-face in the way that we just do everything. The way, obviously in terms of Thatcherism was, and I'm not saying we go down Thatcherism Mark II and it's just a more extreme version. I don't know what the solution is the point I'm making, but it just strikes me as we need to do something dramatically different. And everybody knows it, and nobody's prepared to do it. And I suppose if you're a politician, one of your examples, and obviously it was always thus, Dennis Healy running down the Labour conference, and I think it was 76, just off the plane from wherever it was, Switzerland or wherever, with the piece of paper from the IMF bailing Britain out, saying, we're not going bust tomorrow, we can keep trading. So it's ever thus that the markets have determined stuff. But I just wonder if there's we as a country have deindustrialised and become so massively dependent on the City of London that what happened with Truss, and as I say, I'm not saying what she did was the right thing, but somebody trying something dramatically different would just make all politicians going, poof, I'm not repeating that. I'm not going to be a cabbage in the front page of the paper. I wonder if you think that we're in that catch-22. We all know massive change, and they're all too frightened to make massive change because they don't know how to take the city along with the change they need to make. And they know if they don't, they're doomed.
Well, the current Chancellor was sold to us on the basis of her knowledge and relationship with the city.
Yeah.
That was, this was an economist coming into the role that would not make the mistakes of Liz Truss. Now, clearly there's a debate since the budget about whether markets and business has been taken on a journey. I go back to where I started, because I think it is to me this is the flavour of this year. On all fronts, this is a pivotal year. Every decision that the new UK Labour government takes or does not take this year, this calendar year, will have a positive or detrimental effect on the next 10 years. This is the pivotal year. So, there's a government with a big mandate. We have a leader, a Prime Minister, who has set his stall out about, I sorted out the Labour, I sorted out my party. It's always I, it's me, it's always it's my government. Very, present himself to the country as a very strong leader. Well, this year's the test. These are the big questions you have to grapple with. And the decisions that you face, and they will have to be taken this year. Next year will be more difficult. There are elections across the United Kingdom. They bought themselves some time by, postponing some of the significant council elections in England this year. So political time's been bought. Next year will be distractions of parliamentary elections in Scotland and Wales. And you've got to take these decisions and hold your nerve in the face of, being in government or running a council, like running any business, is hard. Mm-hmm. Because one of the things that you can never account for is the old Harold Macmillan, I think it was, adage of events, dear boy, events, because things will happen internationally or nationally, or terrible weather conditions, whatever that you've got to be resilient about, and you've got to keep your, the Prime Minister talks a lot about being a mission-led government. Well, I think we're all kind of just waiting to see how the meat and the bones of those missions, which central to it is we're told to be growth, how they will pan out. Pivotal year. Every decision they take or don't take this year, to me, this is the 12 months where there's a big opportunity to take the right decisions. Lies, anything put off to next year or beyond.
Well, it's that famous thing of you can't make any policies from opposition, right? So the most important thing for any political party is winning the next election. So therefore, if you have a 5-year electoral cycle, you have to cram any decisions that might be unpalatable, economic decisions in particular, you have to cram them into the first year, 18 months, so that any negative consequences are happening in the following year to 18 months, so that people start to feel better. If it's going to be negative impacts of what you're doing, people start to feel better towards the end of year 3 and year 4 or 5 for you to be able to win the next election. And that's what I don't understand about the slowness of appears to be slowness of their decision making on these major decisions. You would have thought, if you've been in opposition for 14 years, okay, so Starmer himself, it's only 2-3 years, but you'd thought you'd have we are ready to go, hit the ground running, we're opening the door and we are sprinting in here. And the hardest thing, again, I think about this, if you speak to any Conservatives from when Blair was in power, the hardest thing is getting any traction at all in the news when you've been the party of power for more than a decade and you're now out the door. The first year or two of an opposition leader is horrendous because you just can't get the news agenda. Yet the news agenda appears to be getting run by Nigel Farage and Reform, for me as an outsider looking in. So I'm not quite sure what the strategy is.
Well, this is another dynamic that the government is having to face that perhaps, certainly in my living memory, at our lifetimes, I don't think you could say that the current state of affairs has ever been a three-party scenario.
No.
Never has there been a three-party scenario. We've got, there was huge excitement politically in the media when the SNP in 2015 got 56 seats out of a parliament of 650. But there is no question that what Reform is currently doing, can they last the pace? Who knows? A lot of that would depend on the performance of Starmer and his government. That they are filling the vacuum that appears to have existed, disappointment that appears to exist during these first few months of the Labour government. And, polling since the new year is is putting the country evenly split, 24-25% to Labour, Conservatives and Reform at a UK level. So it's another dynamic in terms of the decision making that the government has got to consider, is that there is the old adage that it's very hard for the opposition party that has been in power for, because it generally is more than a decade when power changes hand between the two main parties of this country, to get any traction. Well, they don't need to at the moment to put pressure under the government or to create a media momentum, because Reform is doing that, and frankly they're doing it very, very successfully, not just south of the border, but they've made in a very short period of time significant progress in Scotland too. So there's this whole other political dynamic, which, if you want to be positive about it, it should help put the kind of pressure you need on your party of government to be working even harder and be even more focused in doing the right thing in order to hold support and build for the next election. Again, back to 2025 as a pivotal year on so many fronts for the Reform Party, the new guys on the block, who have made a very big impact since July, and with the return of Nigel Farage and them getting their first members of Parliament elected, and whatever guys the Reform, but they were UKIP and they were the Brexit party in some shape or form. It's a pivotal year for them as well, because if they're not sitting in the same position a year from now, the question mark will be, was it just a bubble? Was it just an instant reaction to some early disappointment in the new government?
Yeah, because when you were saying not seen it before, the nearest would be when the SDP, and you had in that period around 82, 83, 84, when you had the SDP and Liberal Democrat, or Liberal Party as it would have been at the time, coalition, they were polling higher than, they were the second party in the UK. But when that didn't translate directly to electoral success, it very quickly came to, you're just a party of protest that people shout about, but when it comes down to it, they don't vote for you. And I suppose that would be Reform's challenge, that they need to translate that into council seats and Holyrood seats in 2026, to be able to illustrate to people, no, we can translate protest votes into protest votes in opinion polls.
And you're quite right. Here's the different dynamic from the SDP Liberal Alliance of the 80s, where they could win parliamentary by-elections and the like, and was an easy option when people were angry for opinion polling, because the polls are just a snapshot of that time and all the rest of it. Here's a different dynamic for any party, and particularly for new parties, is you now have these very significant Scottish Parliament and Welsh Parliament elections that can be used mid-term of a UK Labour government to say, look, we're not just a protest party, and we're not a wasted vote when it comes to the big general election. We actually can win seats. So it does bring a different dynamic to it. And of course, it's a pivotal year in Scotland in terms of Scottish politics as well, because it's the last full calendar year before the Scottish Parliament has its elections in May 2026, and like our UK Parliament, like our councils in Scotland, not all of them in England, it's an all-out election. All our MSPs are up for re-election, and it's pivotal for the SNP. There is some signs of recovery and stability under the Swinny Forbes leadership as they look forward to 2026 and kind of move on as much as they can from the instability after Nicola Sturgeon left, and the kind of really quite unstable period during the Humza leadership period, and in the backdrop of a disappointing performance of the UK Labour government. So that there is stability for them. Can they build on that towards and take advantage of it in 2026? What impact does Reform have? And where is their political agenda? And the thing that has been, top of our podcast has been the Scottish Housing Bill. And, we know that in the next few weeks that amendments to that bill, heavily trailed, is going to be good news for the housing industry, particularly for private sector investment. It's going to bring a more pragmatic approach to issues around rent levels and rent caps and all of these issues that have been holding back in investment, and we expect that to take its course through parliamentary votes and hopefully be done and dusted over spring into early summer. So pivotal year in terms of the housing bill, pivotal year for both the governing party and for what is, although the third party, the Parliament, the main opposition, the Labour Party, in moving towards the 2026 election. But for what we're specifically interested in, when that housing bill is done and dusted, it then becomes a pivotal year for the housing industry, who have asked so much and have been so detrimentally affected by the uncertainty around the housing bill, that when we have that certainty, it will now be very interesting to see what comes out through the industry to try and pick up the agenda around investment and getting the momentum into that aspect of the housing market. So, everywhere we look, it just feels as if 2025 is a big year, and it's a pivotal year for housing, for the economy, for politics, for the international stage.
And that housing bill is really important to then bring it down from this bigger political chat. The housing bill is really important because, as you know, the one thing that nobody likes is uncertainty. And it would just be great. I keep using the point of, roughly, very loosely, from 1988 to 2018, there was no new legislation for 30 years impacting the private rented sector in Scotland. And then, over the next 4 or 5 years, there was 3 or 4 pieces of legislation that impacted the private. Some of it was reactive stuff to do with COVID and things like that. But there was 4 or 5 things impacting the private rented sector. We just need, this is the bill, this is what it's going to be, and we're settling down, and that's it. Not giving an indication 6 months down the line that, there's obviously issues in that, and we'll be revisiting it again. What you need is stability and certainty. And interestingly, I went for a coffee end of last week with someone who owns a decent-sized lettings business in the west of Scotland. And we were both talking about how it started because a younger member of staff who works for me is looking to buy property. He listens to this, so you'll know who I'm talking about. And I was just talking him through the benefits of owning property for long term. That despite all the scaremongering about stuff, and I gave a real example of a property that I knew of that had been bought 19 years ago, how much it had cost, how much the mortgage would have been, and how much the rent would have been. And it was something along the lines of the £9,000 deposit that had bought that property with a buy-to-let mortgage. That property now being sold, and the profit to the owner, paying off some of the mortgage and various bits and pieces, was like 50-60 grand. If you'd taken that £9,000 and stuck it in the building society, taken none of the interest out and compounded it up, I think it was about 14 grand you would have 18, 19 years later. So 9 grand has turned into 50, 60 grand in housing.
Yeah.
9 grand in the building society would have turned into 14 grand in the same period of time. Housing is still a great investment for people. It's important that people, if they are going to invest in housing, are cognizant of it's not as easy as sticking the money in the building society. You could have a boiler breakdown, you could have a burst pipe, and you've got to fix it because it might be your investment and you want to protect that. That's one reason to fix it. But the other reason to fix it is it's somebody's home and they live in it. So you might have an out of the blue cost of a couple of grand that you weren't expecting, that if you stick it in the building society, it's not going to come. But long term it works. So I was discussing this with this person who owns a lettings business, and he then says, have you had any landlords saying that they're selling to get out of the market because of all these changes? Actually selling, not saying next time my tenant leaves I'm getting out, but actually getting out because of what's happening in the market. And I had to say no, and he said no.
Well, that's very interesting.
So what I thought was interesting about that is there's been a lot of negative, this is horrendous, what they're doing to the housing market's terrible, what they're doing to landlords is terrible. And it has become more onerous than landlords. But the two things you need to consider is, again, when I have come across somebody who said, if they've been a multiple prop landlord, I'm getting out of the market. All right, okay. So let's mythically take you sell a property for 100 grand. Firstly, you're going to have capital gains tax to pay on that. Even after that, where are you sticking your 100 grand to get the same appreciation and debt service. Where are you getting anywhere that gives you what property gives you?
Well,
and they never answer it.
And that non-answer speaks volumes.
Yep.
And what all of this does, I think, that anecdotal story that actually underlines, even when non-answer, evidence. What all of what we're talking about in this kind of setting the scene for 2025 in a very macro way, really, to me, underlines the fact that housing is still, as it has been for almost 40 years, the backbone of the UK economy.
Yeah.
The backbone. So, we're drawing to a close, I think, of this podcast. We've talked a lot about our setting the scene for 2025, some predictions, some things that need to signpost, and we'll return to, not least the housing bill, when things become a bit clearer with the various amendments to the bill, and no doubt do a podcast probably specifically on that for our listeners and viewers. Do we have a out the box, this might not quite happen, but here's a wee wild prediction? I have one. I don't know if it's a prediction, but I'll go first, and maybe you one as well. I think that not since the 2014 independence referendum has Scotland had the potential profile it's going to have on the international stage again. Because politically, Scotland's now become somewhere that a lot of people thought was not fertile ground for the Reform Party. With the big agenda around energy infrastructure and data centres, and a priority of it being the UK government, Scotland geographically is very fertile for that. Depending on what Trump does with his tariffs, a potentially big impact on parts of the Scottish economy where we are big exporters, not least in whisky. So, maybe we are going to have a profile that since the independence referendum we hadn't had. Therefore, here's a wee thing to signpost predict. Maybe we'll find that Scotland has, and of course because he's got his own interest with his golfing here, maybe we'll see a kind of Trump and Farage attention in Scotland that no other small country in the world, perhaps except Greenland, will get. So watch out for a Trump Farage interest in Scotland over the next few
now
weeks.
That you say that and talk that through, I don't have anything as groundbreaking that I think is unusual that might happen in 2025. I think the thing to come out of our podcast is, I think you're right. I think, and the other thing that might materialise in 2026 over the if we look 18 months ahead, on that continued thing, I think Scotland might start to be, on your very point, the first place where it looks like Reform have usurped the Conservative Party as the party of the right and embedded themselves in that position. Might also be the first place where the incumbent, people are talking about, it's so volatile in politics these days that whoever's in charge is losing. Scotland might buck that trend too, isn't it? We're now seeing the SNP settle back down, and Labour's lead in Scotland come right down. That we might see that double whammy play out over the next 18 months of Reform usurp the Conservatives as the party of the right in Scotland, and the SNP buck that trend of a party in power actually staying in power.
So, pivotal year for the economy, pivotal year for housing, pivotal year for politics, and maybe a pivotal year for Scotland. I think all our viewers and listeners should keep themselves glued to our podcast.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. So with that, we will say thanks everybody for listening and watching, and we'll speak to you again soon. Thanks for listening to the Scottish Housing Podcast with Stephen Purcell and me, Brian Gilmore. To ensure you don't miss an episode, please follow us and subscribe wherever you pick up your podcasts. To find out more about the presenters, go to scottishhousingpod.com, and to get all the latest information about forthcoming guests and new episodes, follow us on social media at Scottish Housing Pod.